to you one of the newest members of our board of directors. He headed the Child Welfare League Task Force on Adoption. He is head of the Chicago Child Care Society, and he's one wonderful human being. Mr. Ken Watson.
Good morning again. It's good to be here. Welcome. Welcome both to the conference and to Chicago. The Chicago Child Care Society, I'm the assistant director, is the co-sponsor of the conference. So I welcome you officially on behalf of them, and I welcome you personally as a resident of Chicago. I hope you're going to enjoy the conference and enjoy the city while you're here. I also want to thank you for electing me to your board of directors. I really am looking forward to it. I consider it an honor. My glasses aren't quite in focus. I consider it an honor to be on your board, and it's not only an honor, I look forward to the work that's going to be involved in joining you more actively in the goals that we're trying to pursue. Little did any of us know a year ago or so, when the title of the conference, Winds of Change, was selected, the changes that would occur within that year. We didn't know the Berlin Wall would fall down. We didn't know that Nelson Mandela would be set free. We didn't know that the Soviet Empire would begin to dissemble. We live in an age of change, and we live in an age of great hope. Is it any wonder then that we, all of us in this room, face with renewed hope that adoption is really about to enter a new age? This conference is about that new age and how we can work to bring it about. As many of you know, I am not a member of the Adoption Triangle. I'm a professional social worker in adoption and have been for 36 years. I started very young in knickers. But I have worked in that time actively, I think, in all phases of adoption. I've counseled birth parents. I've assessed and prepared adoptive families and children for adoption. I've placed those children in adoption. I've provided clinical help and counseling to individuals and families who've been in adoption. I've been involved in searches and in reunions. And during that time, I have seen many changes. I think most of them within myself, but many of those changes in adoption also. What I have learned from the experiences that I've had, from the mistakes that I've made and other professionals have made. Mostly what I have learned from those who have experienced adoption as a part of their life. And that's why I'm very pleased to be here at this conference and to have a chance to work more closely with the Congress. Some of you remember last year in New York that one of the people that attended the conference was my niece, who was adopted. And I have learned some things as I have followed her through this year as she has pursued her search. Partly propelled by the impetus of that conference, she has completed a successful search and had a reunion with her birth mother last October. And the reason she's not at this conference this year is she's on her way to have a reunion with her birth father this coming weekend. The birth mother reunion was successful. That both people, responded to each other, and they have a relationship or are struggling to make a relationship that has meaning for them. I think what I learned from watching her in that experience was when she went to meet her birth mother, and they began, after they got through the initial emotional exchange, they began to talk about facts, and the facts around the birth experience did not jibe. And if you can imagine the impact of 2 or 3 hours into the reunion, and my niece says to her mother, "Gee, I'm sorry, it must have been a terrible labor for you." And her mother says, "No, it was very easy. It was only 2 hours." And my niece says, "But they told me it was 13 hours. And then they went on and began to check, and the facts didn't match. Now imagine the impact of that when you've already gone through the emotion of reunion, and then you begin to have some questions, and then they looked at each other and they did not look alike. And fortunately for my niece, she called back to her sister, the birth child, who is her sister in her adoptive family, upset and concerned about this late at night, and of course wondering, was this indeed the right woman? And as they went through it and began to compare the significant facts, you know, the date, the time, the name of the mother, the name that she gave the baby in the hospital, that specific hospital, it was very clear there could be no mistake. And the mistake was in the agency's information and what they had shared with my niece. And that was a terrible thing. And the shock, imagine the shock on someone who's been gathering information on adoptions for years, and I'm sure who has made some similar careless mistakes. So we keep learning. And I think part of the impetus that propelled her from her reunion with her birth mother to her birth father was the fact that she did not look like birth mother or any of the half-siblings that she discovered in that family. And she was able to locate her birth father, and as I say, is on her way now. And I think what propelled her to move so quickly on that is when they sent pictures, she does look like her birth father, and she looks exactly like half-siblings on that side of the family, you know. So I learned again from this experience how careless agencies can be with people's lives, and I saw again how important it is for all of us to find someone who looks like us. Last year I had an opportunity to address you at the conference in New York on the lifetime impact of adoption and share some thoughts about the clinical issues. And today I would like to talk about some of the changes that have happened in adoption. Not what the changes are, but how they came about and how we can work to bring them about more effectively. I came into adoption at a time when birth mothers used aliases when they went to maternity homes, and when I, as a worker, had to keep a coded list. If I wanted to talk to Peggy Smith, I had to call the maternity home and ask for Ann Jones. I came into adoption when the most famous words of all social work dumb for birth parents were, "And now you can go on with your life." And believe me, I did not invent them, but I have said them over and over again, without realizing, with no malice, without realizing, as a birth mother told me, you know, that was probably the biggest lie you ever told. And then this birth mother in my office said, I have not gone on with my life stalled on that day, and that's why I'm back here now 21 years later, to be able to go on with my life, to learn about my son, and to be able to move my own life forward. I came into adoption when workers went to adoptive parents in unmarked cars late at night, so the neighbors wouldn't know that the family was going to adopt and could pretend that the new baby that arrived was born to them. When we focused on matching, when we tried so hard to make sure that the children we placed with the adoptive parents not only looked like them, but shared their capacities, their talents, their feelings, all sorts of things that we could not possibly do but thought we were doing, and even if we could, we shouldn't have. I came into adoption when we carefully patterned adoption after nature. 2 children, first only 1, and then we thought, oh my word, we're producing a generation of single children, and some of the literature says that's not so good, so we'll do 2. But always the male child first, and then waiting carefully 2 years, and then comes the female child, and then comes the dog Spot, so to speak. You know, we were carefully crafting families to match our stereotypes and society's stereotypes. I came into adoption when we divided children into 2 groups, the adoptable and the unadoptable children. I came into adoption when we laid on every adopted child's shoulder, and we, the profession of social worker, did this, the burden of being the chosen child. Yes, all of these things that were part of my experience in adoption when I began all have in common that I came into adoption, and people entered adoption under the false promise of anonymity and the destructiveness that brings about. But I want to talk about not those things and not the changes, but how some of those changes have occurred, particularly changes within social agencies and the structure and the political structure within which we work. And then I want to talk about what we can do to bring about those changes that yet need to be done to bring about them more quickly. The two biggest flaws in adoption is the way I as a social worker, as part of the crafter of the adoption system, the two biggest flaws about the adoption process as we've developed it is that psychologically, adoption as we have historically operated and developed it denies the reality that the adoptive person always belongs to two families, the family into which that child is born and the family in which that child is raised and nurtures. And the second flaw, that's the psychological flaw. The practical flaw is that we have denied adults the right to information and control over their own lives. The central thrust of life is to create ourselves. Maturity means making choices for oneself and taking responsibility for those choices and the consequences of one's actions. And that implies that people, given adequate and accurate information, are able to make better decisions for themselves than other people are able to make for them. Society and social work agencies, adoption agencies in particular, took control of adoption, however, and in that process, we disabled the members of the triangle by denying them information and participation and decision-making power in the adoption experience. We denied birth parents the opportunity to have a free choice or for alternate services. We denied until recently their participation in an open process in terms of adoption. We denied adoptive parents their rights as human beings and adults by putting them through an obstacle course, at the end of which, if they had proved themselves worthy, they were given a child by the agency. And all the time we as social workers complained about having to play God. That was not our complaint, that was our wish. Because we said to ourselves, we're going to give this family the child that God should have if he knew as much as we did. And for adopted persons, we denied them. Denied by age any part of the decision-making process, and denied forever by adoptive status information about that decision and the right to contact with all of the others who were involved in making it. Now, don't misunderstand me. Don't get me wrong. After 36 years in adoption, I still believe in adoption. I still believe in it as a way of serving children and families, and I still believe in agency process with all its flaws. I still believe that we can keep doing it and can finally get it right. I think that society needs to protect children and support families, and adoption is the way to do that for some people. I think adoption has two functions. One is to assure parents that their children will have ongoing legal parental nurture when those parents themselves are unable to provide it for their children. And I think adoption provides a way to make sure that all children who are in need of such permanent legal parenting can get it, regardless of their age, race, quotes, special needs, unquotes, or the limitations of the system or of the parents who gave them birth. It's a big job, and society through its social agencies has not done it as well as I wish we have. I believe that we all share the responsibility for making adoption better. I'm going to talk now about change, and talk about change at three levels. I'm going to talk about changing the political structure, which is the fabric of our society, or societal change. I'm going to talk about changing the systems or organizations to which we belong or in which we work, institutional change, and I'm going to talk about changing ourselves, personal change. The three levels are not discrete. The boundaries are blurred. Each of the three levels is itself a system, and it's also part of a larger system. And any change in any one part of a system has impact on the entire system and on interlocking systems. Let me start by talking about political or societal change. I'd like to talk about how that occurs, and I'm drawing here in terms of my understanding from some material that Gary Wills, the political commentator, has developed and shared and written about. He suggests, and I concur, that societal change occurs as a result of the efforts of two groups of people, our prophets and our politicians, and each has a role to play. But we need to be clear about what the role of each is. Prophets are always a minority voice. They are the first to tell us that something is wrong and to demand that we do something about it. Politicians represent the majority voice. They delay in making change until they have to, until they are sure that most people want it. So societal change always begins with the prophets. They are the uncompromising fools who know that something is wrong, and damn it, they won't stop talking about it. These are the first proponents of change, and they always pay a terrible price. They are dismissed, they are ridiculed, they are persecuted. I'm talking about people like Jean Payton, struggling to launch Orphan Voyage, spurned by her professional colleagues. I'm talking about people like Florence Fisher, who went to an international conference in Milan in mid-70s to present material and was booed off the podium and ultimately had her mic cut off. I'm talking about Lyndon Cannon Burgess, who's the director of an agency, was threatened in terms of her position because she was divulging information that she shouldn't. And people like Harriet Fricky, who was a friend of mine and a social worker in an agency in Minnesota, who was drummed out of the agency because she held convictions that adoption records should be open. The strength of our prophets lies in their conviction. What they lack in numbers, they make up in intensity. You don't need a lot of people like that to initiate change. Now, politics, on the other hand, is the art of compromise. Change is initiated by a principled few, the prophets, not the compromising many, the politicians. Prophets are the scandal in democracy because they are not representative. They stand apart from our society and yell and speak and will not be moved until society recognizes them and begins to respond. So that we owe to the prophets the initiation of change. But we do not want to spurn the politicians, because although the prophets are the ones who pay the greatest price, dismissed, ridiculed, persecuted, the politicians also pay a price, because we are always criticizing them for their compromises without failing to realize that politics is the art of compromise, and the better they compromise, the better they are as politicians. So we, in a sense, attack them for their strengths, because we who are not politicians are uncomfortable with those compromises, just as we who are not prophets are uncomfortable with the noise that the prophets make. When the prophets persist, a few politicians begin to listen, but they don't listen to join the prophets, but to shut them up. Political change is never the result of rational debate, but of a series of mutual trade-offs and vetoes. Political candidates are always trying to please their electorate. They try to get as close to the mainstream as they can in order to get elected and stay in office. And that's why when we have elections, all of our candidates end up saying essentially the same thing. Because if you say something out here, you're going to lose all that middle vote. So I start on the right and you start on the left. And I think I've got the far right people and you've got the far right left people, but they won't elect us. So we each move toward the middle trying to capture more and more of the middle vote and end up side by side, arguing essentially the same kinds of positions, because if we do not, we're not going to get elected. Politicians want to avoid taking a controversial stand. They want to confirm what everyone already knows and believes or agrees upon. So our elections ratify retrospectively change that has already taken place. Let me shift now and talk a bit about organizational change or institutional change. Organizational change goes on all the time because organizations must change to survive. And let me talk about this organization, about our organization, about AAC. The theme of this conference, bringing about change, that theme itself reflects the capacity of this organization to recognize its need to change. The organization began with a focus on the support and healing that comes from talking about one's personal experiences, sharing them with others, sharing the pain, sharing the convictions, and feeling some sense of support. That was the origins. And to that, and that's still a function that we must continue to perform, to that we have added the task of seeking to reform adoption. And I'm using that as a hyphenated word, to reform adoption. To reform the system through opening records. And so we sought out a wider forum in which to make public statements, and that's where we have been, I think, for the past few years. And now with this conference we shift gears again, if you will, and make another change, because healing ourselves is important and necessary and must go on. And articulating our position and gaining a wider audience is important and must go on. But now it's the time to generate collective action to bring the reform about. There's a paradox in talking about organizational change or institutional change, because organizations come into business, into operation, come into being to perform a certain function. And once they begin to perform that function well, by design, organizations talk about institutionalizing their procedures, to make solid, to institutionalize, to make rigid the procedures they have established that work. They institutionalize themselves and in the process lock themselves into where they have been and lose sight of where they have yet to go. And the paradox is that if the organization is to stay in business, it has to maintain a certain sense of equilibrium. So you can't change too much or you're going to go out of business. And you can't change, if you don't change at all, you're going to be out of business. You're either going to change from chaos or change from being too concrete. So that there is a paradox in institutional organizational change in trying to get that right pace, trying to maintain your balance and your perspective while at the same time incorporating new material and new plans. It's the problem that any system has in terms of trying to incorporate newness and still maintain its focus. All organizations have to struggle with this balance. They struggle with keeping up with the business at hand and also maintaining themselves as a functioning organization, and this generates resistance. It is the nature of change. It's a cliche, the nature of change to always generate its own resistance. In part, this is the concern about the system losing its balance, but in part it's our own reaction to change and to loss. If, after looking at your program this morning, this room had been announced as the meeting room, and when you got here there was a sign that says the meeting has been changed to another room 4 down the way, most of us would be upset. That's not because we have to walk those extra few blocks, because it represents a change. I can hear us grumbling now, and I'd be the first of the grumblers. Why the hell couldn't they get this worked out last night? You know, what kind of a hotel is this that doesn't know this? Does it mean we don't have enough people or too many people? Blah, 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 blah. We would grumble away about a trivial change because it bothers our own stability and our own equilibrium, and institutions have to deal with that periodically and continually. And what resistance does organizational resistance take? What pattern does it take? Well, having worked in an organization, an institution, a social agency for 36 years, I can pretty well know what's going to happen. A new idea or a suggestion for change comes up, and the first response is, It'll never work. Why try it? And then a couple of people on the edge will say, oh, hey, we tried it once and it didn't work. And then they'll say, well, it might work, but if we do it, Jesus, that means I've got to change offices. That means we've got to come in at a different time. I'm going to have to give something up. And is it worth it to try this new idea when I've got to give something else up? I've got to make a trade-off. And then we say, well, okay, it might work, but it's going to cost more, it's going to take longer, it's going to burn out staff, it's going to do all these. And gradually we work our way through this process of deciding to, well, okay, we'll try it. And then the grumblers still grumble. Well, it wasn't worth it. And then after a while, when it was worth it, is, I told you all along, you know. And then we're into a new pattern and a new way of thinking until the next impact of the next change comes along. But you can work through that resistance to change. And as an administrator of an agency, and by definition, private social agencies have conservative boards. I mean, if they didn't, they wouldn't be in business. It's the job of the board to keep the agency stable. It's the job of the administration to rock the boat. So there's always a tension between administration and board. And so you have to think about what's going to happen. And for me, the board's pattern of resistance to change follows what I've just said, and my response follows. I mean, we do a dance, if you will. It's almost as if we both are following a script, because they know what's going to happen. Most recently, I've been arguing with my board about the fact that we need to commit money and we need to commit staff to formalizing post-legal adoption services, that we cannot put families together and wish them well. It's like saying to the birth mothers, you know, go on with your life. We can't say that to adoptive families either. We know now that we put a family together that we can anticipate there are going to be difficulties and stresses and strains on that family, and we have to make sure the service is available. And my board says, but we can't afford it. We're already stretched to the maximum. So this is the current argument. Whatever the argument is I'm having with board, my process is the same, and it's a simple four-step process. And I'm going to condense it. It doesn't take place this neatly. Nothing ever does. No process ever takes place as neatly as when you describe it. But I will say to my board, as I did, this agency needs to provide post-adoption services to all of the families it serves. And they say, never. Excuse me. I wait, and 6 months later I say, this agency needs to provide post-adoption services to all the families that it serves. And they say, why? 6 months later, I say to my board, this agency needs to provide post-adoption services to all the families it serves. And they say, how? And 6 months later, I say again, this agency needs to provide post-adoption services to all the families it serves. And they say, when? It's a process of allowing people to accommodate themselves to change and having the conviction and the persistence to stay with it. Let me shift then to my third level of change and talk about personal change. In a sense, this should come first, because all change, I think, begins with changes within ourselves. But I put it on the bottom of my list simply to draw attention to it, because I want to focus a little of our attention on this now. All of us live our lives within four boundaries. One of those boundaries are our values and our beliefs. Another boundary is the knowledge that we have. A third boundary is our abilities or our capacities, and the fourth boundary is the structure within which we work. Now, all these boundaries are flexible, but none of them moves very easily. Of the four, the structure is the easiest to move. You can change structure, you can change the situation in which you work, you can change the clubs or the organizations to which you belong. And the hardest of the boundaries to change are our values. None of us wants to change what we believe. And when new knowledge comes by, you say, well, that's an interesting research report, and I'm glad you brought it about. But we're going to go on doing what we do because I know this is the right thing to do. Don't bother me with the facts. My mind's made up based on my convictions and my values, so that the value base is the most rigid. If I were to ask everyone in this room, and I'm not asking this, to raise your hand if you are now practicing a fundamentally different religion than that of your parents who raised you, I would get in a group this side maybe 3, 4 hands. Because we grow up with the values of our families. And that's one of the things that families are to do, is to pass along the value system of our society. And when I ask that question, and I have sometimes, I'm not asking for people who change from Baptist to Methodist to Episcopalian. I'm talking about changing from Christian to Jew, from Jew to Muslim, from Muslim to Hindu. Not many people make those kinds of changes. And some people will argue that they've made such a change because they grow up in opposition to their parents' beliefs. My parents, I was raised in the Catholic Church and I'm anti-Catholic. Hey, you're still in the same value framework. Do you follow what I'm saying? So we don't move out of the value framework very quickly or very easily. But we can. Any change in this personal system is very hard for us because it upsets our own personal balance, just as organizational change upsets the institution or organization. Change within ourselves affects our personal balance. It involves taking risks, and it takes energy. So why do we change? Why don't we all stay where we are? Well, there's a natural impetus in all of us towards growth and maturation. No matter how hard we fight it, we all get physically older, and we all get psychologically more mature. We change out of our pain or discomfort with what is, and we change when pushed by circumstances and other people, so that personal change occurs as a result of external force. So that keep that in mind when we think about how we can mobilize and help other people to change in the directions that we think it's time for them to move. Let me then talk about how we bring about change. Change begins with individuals. How do we change? Remember the 4 boundaries. We re-examine our values. Our values, my values, are what I call your biases. They are what we believe. And we can attack them in others, but we find it hard to question them in ourselves, and we need to. Because one of the paradoxes of life is that we must act as if our beliefs are absolutely true in order to have conviction, while at the same time holding in our mind that they may be all wrong. And it's hard to keep your mind open to the fact that you may be wrong, while at the same time acting with the conviction that you can't be wrong. And the only way to do that, seems to me, is to constantly re-examine our own values and our own beliefs, and to talk with people who may question those beliefs, and to question them ourselves. Knowledge, we seek to expand our knowledge, and to do that we should seek people who think differently from us. None of us do that. We tend to congregate with people who share our ideas. We read and talk with those with whom we agree. The magazines we read support our convictions and our biases and give us knowledge which supports them rather than knowledge that challenges them. If you are a conservative, you ought to be reading a liberal journal. If you're a liberal, you ought to be reading a conservative journal. We ought to read those people and those things that don't agree with us. When we have an AAC conference, we ought to welcome voices of people who disagree with us in order to expand our own knowledge and reconfirm our own beliefs. With regard to our abilities, we're talking now about risk. To risk is dangerous, but not to risk is fatal. I'd like to quote that famous American philosopher, Evel Knievel, who says you can't leap across a canyon in 2 small jumps. That it is necessary to take risks to accomplish things. There are some things you cannot do in small increments. You've got to do it and take a chance. But that doesn't mean that you need to be foolhardy, because you can manage risks. And managing risks means anticipating potential problems before they occur and begin to develop strategies for handling them. And we'll get back to this as we think about what we ought to be doing next. And finally, the structure, which I said we need to look at as the fourth personal boundary. How do you change the structure? That's easy. You modify the structure in which you work, or you move out of that structure. And for social workers, this is something that I keep telling them all the time. They say, I can't stand to work in this agency. Fine. Change it or leave. I mean, it's as simple as that. I can't change it, goodbye. I haven't got the energy to change it, goodbye. Because you change structure or you leave it. And if you are in a structure that binds you, it is your own fault. But among these four personal boundaries, there's something I have not yet talked about which is important. Not only do you need to examine your values, your knowledge, your abilities, and your structure, but you need to bring them into congruence. They need to fit one on top of the other. Otherwise, you lack internal stability, or what we call peace of mind. If you're going to be an effective change agent, you've got to get your own house in order, and you've got to get these things congruent, fitting on top of each other. Some social workers I know are working in agencies, and their own personal belief system is not that of the agency. And if they can't change the agency's belief system to match their own, then they better get out of there, because working in a situation where you believe something different than your agency puts you in an untenable situation and grinds away at your inner gut. And that, my friends, is why people burn out. I said last year, 36 years in the business, I'm not burned out. I'm not even singed around the edges. I'm just getting going. You bring these things into congruence. You live with your beliefs. You design a structure that you can work with, or you move out of that structure. You incorporate the knowledge and beliefs and get them to fit together, not by denying the knowledge, by challenging it and changing your values in response to it. There's an awful lot of research going on in adoption. Some of it I don't like. Some of it I don't believe. Partly because I don't want to believe it, partly because it's not valid research. But I'm reading it, I'm challenging it, I'm looking, I'm trying to make sure that everything that we know about adoption somehow fits together, not perfectly, but it's coherent, it's congruent. Otherwise you can't stand it. And that, of course, it means the issue of personal morality too. I question the morality, and everybody can judge someone else's morality more easily than your own. But I question the morality of people who stay working in a job where they don't share the convictions of the people that employ them, and then either have to sacrifice their personal integrity or sacrifice their personal morality. I mean, one way or the other, you're in a bind. Well, within an institution, how do we bring about institutional change? Let me talk about it two ways. Both institutional change from within an agency, I'm talking now about adoption agencies, and institutional change brought about by outside. Within an agency, if you work within an agency, if you're a social worker and working in an agency, or you're working within a structure and you want to change that structure, the first thing to do is to identify your easy allies. Don't go after the people that disagree with you. Identify your easy allies. Who are the people who share that conviction or that belief with you? And with the support of that person or persons, you make your case. You state your case. You state it quietly and clearly. And it always sounds better coming from two than from one, or from four than from two. The next step is to seek some support at a higher echelon. If you're an administrator, you seek board support. If you're a beginning worker, you seek supervisory support. You try to move the pressure from change towards the top, because pressure change can initiate at any level of a structure that is implemented from the top level. And finally, you decide on the degree of risk that you are willing to take and the degree of compromise that you are willing to make. And that has to do with agency loyalty. I have sometimes worked in agencies where I've had trouble with some of the policies and procedures. And the issue of loyalty to me is as follows. that when I'm outside my agency, I will protect and defend my agency, not because it's always right, but because I work there. I will say we do it that way, I question it, but it's all right. When I'm within the agency, I do everything I can to change it. So I can say anything I want about my agency inside. I can damn the administration, the board, the staff, the policies, and everything. When I step outside my agency, I respect that agency. And when other people are damning it, I either keep quiet, if I can't defend it, or I defend it where I can. Because if I cannot be loyal, then I don't think I can work there. That doesn't mean I ascribe to everything, but it does mean I have some sense of belonging to that organization. As a member of AAC, criticize it, tear it apart when we talk amongst ourselves. When you step outside and somebody says something about AAC, either defend it if you can, or be quiet if you can't. That's loyalty to an organization. The issue of morality, and I talked about that, and I know some more part of the conference is going to talk about this also. I talked about it last year. I think that's an individual question about one's morality, about whether what you're doing is moral or immoral. If I'm involved in a process that I think is immoral, and my agency will not change it, or I feel they have put me into a bind by setting up a situation where I have to behave in this way, then it's my obligation, I think, to leave that organization. And that borders on legality. What about legality? Is it right to do illegal things? As a social worker in an agency in a state where, quotes, confidential identifying information cannot by law be disclosed, can I break that law? The answer is, of course I can, provided I'm willing to take the consequences of what I'm doing. Sometimes I break the law. Sometimes I do what I know is illegal. And in a sense, sue me, take me to court. I mean, you've got to be willing, if you break the law, it seems to me, to take the consequences of your action, because the law is not always right. And if I don't believe the law is right, I may choose to break it, or I may choose to try and change it. But whichever I do, I've got to do, in my perception, openly, and be prepared to take the responsibility of what I'm doing. Now, change from without. How do people outside of agencies bring about changes in institutions and organizations? How do you, as Triangle members, bring about changes in adoption agencies? Well, first thing is always make your request as an entitlement. Don't ever go to an agency begging for what's rightfully yours. Go in demanding it. If you're begging, they won't give it to you any more than if you're demanding, and it is your right, and you will be respected for your request and pitied for your begging. And keep the pressure on. Persist. Persist. Those in the search organizations in Chicago with whom I've worked know that this has been effective. If somebody calls me, Barbara Gagne or somebody calls me and I say I can't do that, she may call me a week later, why can't you? And she may say such and such an agency is doing it, and I say, well, I don't think that's legal. Well, have you got a legal opinion? Well, who says it's not legal? Well, I don't think it's moral. Then that's your problem. Keep the pressure on, and hold the agency accountable. Agencies are great at covering themselves. It's against the law. What law? Well, it's really not against the law. It's against the rules of the Department of Children and Family Services. What rules? Well, it's really not against the rules. It's against agency policy. Push them into a corner. Sometimes the agencies will use as smoke screens certain rules, regulations, and they may indeed exist, but they're subject to interpretation, and you need to hold the agency accountable for what it is and why they have made that interpretation. And then you need to ask two other questions. What would it take to change that rule, that law, that policy, and how can I help bring this change about? So you confront the agency, you hold them accountable, you ask what needs to happen next, and you offer your services to bring that change about. Finally, on political change, the political process change is not that different from institutional change, I don't think. You identify groups and individuals whose insights and cooperation are necessary or desirable. You form ad hoc alliances for your mutual benefit. You make your own agenda clear, and you assess the nature of the commitment that the other people have to achieving your goal, what their contribution might be, and what it might cost you, and you negotiate their support. The essentials for an effective alliance, I think, are 5. A common goal, clear communication, a mutual respect for the other person, party, or organization, clearly defined roles about who is to do what, and some sort of an emotional connection, because alliances are not intellectual unions, they are effectual unions. I think that one of the tasks to bring about political change is to educate. You enlist the electorate. You have to help people understand why open records make sense. You have to educate politicians. It's important to be clear about your argument, both in what you believe and why it is in the politician's best interest. Remember, politics is the art of compromise. What will the politician gain through supporting your position? It's usually votes, it may be power. Sometimes it's a personal sense of doing what is right. Defend their position against other people. You need to tell them what to say when some voter says, "How come you did thus and so?" Give them an answer based on your experience. Don't leave them supporting your position without having the answers to do so. You want to persuade them. You're, again, trying to seek an effectual alliance with the electorate. Impact on politicians, in making that impact, the facts are important. You start from a factual base, but the feelings will carry the day. What sways a person to vote? What sways a politician? What is in his best interest sways him? And the emotional impact of what he's doing. 2 quick cases in point. The Indian Child Welfare Act is the only piece of federal legislation that specifically prescribes all sorts of facts and policies and structure for adoption. It's the only legislation where it is so carefully spelled out. All the other legislation is state legislation. 96-272 puts down some guidelines, but most adoption legislation is state except the Indian Child Welfare Act. Now, when the Indian Child Welfare Act was first proposed, nobody in Congress gave it a chance of passing. Absolutely nobody. And the response was, if the states can't get together on their act, and if there's no federal legislation adoption, why would the Indian Child Welfare Act pass? And after all, the Indians represent a very small part of the total population, and they did not have an effective lobby. So, there's nobody gave that a chance of passing. The primary sponsor of that bill was Hubert Humphrey. And people said, "Hubert, you're getting old, you're getting senile, it'll never pass, drop it." And Hubert said, "I believe in it," and he had a constituency in his state that backed him. What happened on the day before that act was to come to Congress, to Senate, for vote, Hubert Humphrey died. The next day in Senate, somebody got up and said, "I propose as a tribute to Hubert Humphrey that we vote unanimously on his last piece of legislation." All the hands went up. You see what I mean? The emotion is what carried the day. Now, another example was the greatest piece of federal legislation affecting children has been Public Law 96-272. It's the first piece of federal legislation which had impact on all the states with respect to adoption and foster care. It has its faults, but it's a marvelous piece of legislation that a lot of people worked to bring about. And all of us held our breath and thought it isn't going to pass. There's too many good things in there for us. It's going to be vetoed, it's going to be voted down. So we tried to get all the guns out. Well, what carried the day, and I'm absolutely persuaded of this, is there's an organization called WAIF. And the director of that organization is a former movie star, which most of you in this room are too young to remember, Jane Russell. The senators were not too young to remember Jane Russell. Jane Russell was the first of the sex queens in the movies who did what was then very daring. I mean, she had a low-cut dress on and exposed a little more of her body than was customary in what would now be probably considered family entertainment, and then was quadruple X-rated sort of movies. The movie was The Outlaw. I mean, I'd heard about it, you understand. So somebody said, will Jane Russell talk in support of 96-272? Sure. So they announced far and wide. Now, if you've been to Washington, you know when votes, you're lucky if you can get a quorum. Senators move in and out, they vote, they've got other things to do too. Hey, that hall was packed. And they were all there, and Jane Russell just came down in all her Jane Russellness and said, I think this would be a great bill for you all to pass. Up went the hands, you know. So that the emotional impact is frequently what you call. Now that doesn't mean that you want to go in without your facts. It doesn't mean you don't want to do the groundwork, but don't be surprised if people do not respond to your facts or to your little intellectual impact. You wait for a chance to make the emotional or affectual connection. And you've tried to persuade. Demonstrations are another way. Demonstrations are the public's lobby. And don't be afraid to use demonstrations. Senators and congressmen and politicians are a little uncomfortable if a lot of people are milling around, and it gets them uneasy, you know. Likewise, letters. They respond to the electorate. Don't ever be afraid to send letters and to have mail campaigns. Somebody will say, but you know, it's all form letters and they know it all comes from AAC. That's all right. They suddenly realize how many AAC people are in their electorate, and it makes a difference, so that you need to keep pressure on them too. And finally, and it is finally, the last way to bring about political change, I think, are societal changes through litigation. And I say finally because I think some of us, some of you, some of us may want to jump to litigation too soon. Be careful with the use of litigation, because if you bring a case to court and you lose, it may be a long, long time before you can be successful, because that case that you've lost then stands as case law and will have influence on many, many other people in many, many other cases. So that the trick effective litigation is to try not to bring it until you are reasonably sure you're going to win, because it's a hazardous way to go if you're not. Alma learned that. Some of you are in Alma or connected with that. They brought some cases, litigation cases, some time ago, and they lost, and it stalled them. Now they are about to bring litigation again, as some of you know. They're introducing a case, or may already have, in New Jersey. It's right on the threshold if it hasn't already, and they're approaching it more cautiously this time, and they have a new strategy on litigation, because if it fails in New Jersey, and they think it might, they're going to introduce the same kind of thing in different states. Do you follow? And see what happens, and they're prepared to move out of New Jersey into other states. They're choosing their states carefully. They've chosen their approach carefully. They've changed their strategy around litigation, their tactics, I should say, around litigation. All right. In conclusion, and that always wakes everybody up, doesn't it? I love to say that. In conclusion, everybody, wakes the speaker up too sometimes. In conclusion, I would like to offer 3 cautions as we move into this field of activism. The first of these is the old adage, what will you do if you're successful? Beware of getting your wish. Beware of getting your wish. If records were opened countrywide tomorrow by act of Congress, we would be joyous, and then what would we do? Be prepared. Are you prepared to abandon your organization because records are open? I would hope not. I would hope not. But do you want to keep this organization just for the sake of old time's sake, and we can look back and meet every year and say, gee, remember back in 1991 when records opened, wasn't that great? No. Because if records are opened, adoption will still not be the way you want it to be or the way I want it to be. And I do not want this organization to quit until we get adoption working better. Open records is first and foremost the number one agenda item, but this will not reform adoption. There's a lot of work to be done, and I don't want to do it by myself. I want all of us to work together to reform adoption. Don't wait too long to figure out what's next on your agenda. The March of Dimes made that mistake. They were caught off guard when the polio vaccine was discovered. Some of us remember the days when we used to put our dimes down and they had a literal march of dimes and they collected, hey, the polio vaccine has been discovered. Nobody needs to give money to the March of Dimes anymore. They were caught with an organization, a lot of work to do, but they hadn't thought ahead because they hadn't anticipated that the vaccine's going to be discovered. Now, I firmly believe, I hope this is going on record, that records are going to be open within the next 5 years, possibly 10, but certainly in 10 years those records are going to be open. I know they are, of my own personal conviction. What are we doing now? What are we thinking about in terms of what's going to happen when the records start opening up? We need to anticipate success and be prepared for what will come next. My second caution is that be prepared for and welcome dissension. Because as long as you have a single goal, opening records, you can collect an awful lot of people who share that goal. When that goal is accomplished and you move to a second goal, some of those people are no longer going to want to be with you. And some people are going to think this should be the next goal, and other people are going to say, no, this should be the next goal. So that there's going to be some dissension in your organization. And some people are going to be unhappy, and there's going to be quarreling and quibbling, and that's all right because that's part of the growth process too, in terms of reestablishing what you want to do. But begin to think about that and prepare for it, and do not be surprised when it comes. And do not say, oh my God, the organization's falling apart. Hey, welcome new people in, welcome the dissension, begin to think about where you're going to go next. And the third caution comes in terms of our political activeness. The more politically active you become, the more you have at stake in terms of criticism. Because when you move yourself to the forefront, and somebody decides to run for office, I mean, his past is, or her past is examined and scrutinized, and every skeleton is dragged out of the closet. And the more prominent that person becomes politically, the more skeletons they find in the closet. This organization is becoming very prominent. You are well known around the country. We are well known. We are being asked to comment on all aspects of adoption. We are in the forefront. We're getting more and more publicity. We cannot afford to find skeletons in our own closets. So be prepared. Think ahead. Become clean, squeaky clean. Clean up your act if there's anything that needs cleaning up, because somebody's going to shine a spotlight on you, and is beginning to now. And our effectiveness will be diminished if people can attack us for parts of our past, which may be irrelevant to what we're doing or may be relevant. But we cannot afford to take that chance. Well, all this is when records are open, and I told you my conviction, but they aren't open yet. And it is time to take action. That's why you're here. That's why I'm here. You are members of the Adoption Triangle, and those of us who are members of social agencies are here because we know that opening records helps with the healing process. We're here because we want the support and help for ourselves, and because we want to change the system for the others who are yet to come. And in order to do that, we must move beyond ourselves. There's a point in clinical work where the acceptance and healing of one's own pain is not enough. You've got to do something else. I think it's Carl Whitaker who has a lovely phrase, so what? Now what? And that's where we are. So what? Now what? We agree that it is legally, morally, and psychologically right for records to be open. We agree there's work to be done, but I am convinced that the goal is at hand. Let us use this conference to renew our efforts to bring about the change we seek. It's time now for me to end, and let's get on with this conference. Let's work to heal our pain. Let's work to more fully understand our experiences and to communicate our message to others. And let's work to reform adoption. Winds of change, let us in the next few days generate here a mighty windstorm that will blow the new age of adoption into existence. Thank you.